the previous class we had 2 weeks ago, when we discussed the difference between assessment and evaluation, right? This is more like a practical difference, because you remember I told you some writers consider the two things to be the same, but in fact there is a difference, right? So we talked about that difference. We discussed some of the most important factors in assessment and evaluation in a general way, correct? So talking about them in general. This week, we are trying to discuss the assessment of the skills, right? Because of the communicative approach, which is the most up-to-date methodology when we are not talking about bilingual schools, right? So when we talk about English teaching, right, as a foreign or second language, this communicative methodology is the most acceptable until today, right? And we have come to use a different label, right, in nowadays, which is the contemporary communicative teaching. Why contemporary? Because today we understand that it's important to work with the multi skills idea. So in the past, people usually neglected, left off some skills because they were more difficult for the students, because they were um, kind of long to teach, okay? And after the PCNs, right, for the regular schools, and this idea of the contemporary language teaching, a lot of how can I say this? A lot of supplementary ideas came into focus, and one of the most important one was the idea of the multi skills. So, and that means we needed to work on all the four basic skills. Okay. Also, together with that, the studies by Howard Gardner, okay, came into focus, right? With the idea of the intelligences, okay? So, with these findings by Howard Gardner, um, we also came to use the fluency, accuracy situation, right? So we had 3 points there. Number one, the idea of multi skills. So the idea of trying to balance all the 4 skills so that people could use them equally. So that was an important point, because people came to the conclusion that all the 4 skills were important for literacy. Okay, so we had a difference between, we had more studies concerning the difference between ABC and literacy. So people started to say, okay, if you have language competence, it doesn't mean that you have communicative competence. So you can use, or you can have knowledge of the language, but it doesn't mean that you can use the language socially. So the idea of interaction and the idea of hello, Annie, good morning. Annie?
Good morning, teacher.
Well, we have already started, and in fact, we just started, right? So you just try to hop in and see if you have any questions later on, okay?
Okay.
Can you see the screen clearly, Annie?
Yes,
Okay, good.
I can see.
So, as I was saying, right, most recently, we have come to the conclusion that there is a difference between language competence and communicative competence. So people started to discuss that the fact that you have proficiency in the language, like if you are good at grammar and vocabulary and all those things related to the language competence, it doesn't mean that you have communicative competence. So you can get knowledge of the language, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you are able to use that language socially, like in the demands of your everyday communication. So this is one of the points on teaching today, right? Then we had the PCNs for regular school, where people insisted that we teachers should work with multi skills. And that means working with all the four skills equally. And number three, the idea of the learning styles. The idea that our students have different capabilities. But Howard Gardner, with the idea of the multiple intelligences, he said, okay, everybody, everybody has an individual predominance, both for the intelligence and both for the learning style. But it doesn't mean that they cannot develop the others. Okay? So individually, people have a certain predominance. Like some people are visual, some people are auditory, some people are kinesthetic, for example, children. But it doesn't mean that they cannot develop the others. So what happened? We started to try to put all that into our teaching activities. And as you can see in the screen, what is the idea now? You need to get your book, you need to get the material you use for teaching, and you need to decide which skill that activity is practicing. So listening, reading, writing, and you need to establish a sequence of activities for that skill. For example, you have a pre-phase in which you prepare the students for the activity and the situation. Then you have the on phase when you are using the material itself. And you have a post phase where you need to ask your students to use the language freely. That involves a lot of things. For example, during the pre phase, which in the past people called presentation, you are going to give the students the language they will use in that moment. After that, you're going to use the material the book proposes. And then the post situation, you're going to ask the students to develop fluency, and that means speak or talk freely. This is the communicative idea, okay? So in the post situation, you're going to promote interaction, right? And develop fluency. So group work, pair work, okay? Students will talk freely. One of the consequences, one of the most important consequences is that during the pre and the on phases, you are correcting students, right? You're giving them models. But on the post phase, they are going to be free to produce. So you're not going to correct anymore. You're just going to give them feedback. Very well. So we had there two specific elements: the learning style and the skills. And that's what you can see in this example I'm showing, right? So what do? First, you need to do kind of a questionnaire or kind of an interview with the class so that you can find out what is the learning style predominant in that class. So if you have like 20 students, you do this. This is a diagnostic assessment. You decide, you establish the predominant learning style in that class. Then what happens? You bring that decision, that information you have into your lesson plan. Of course, you're going to use that learning style more frequently because it's the predominant. But it doesn't mean you're going to forget the others. So what you can see in this example is exactly the most important consequence of this information. You get your material, you decide what the book shows, like what is listening, what is reading, and then if you have a visual learning style in that activity, if you have a kinesthetic style, so you label the activities of the book into skill and learning style. After that, you try to supplement what is missing more, okay, and what you need more. In that way, you make sure you're using a balanced approach, both for learning styles and skills. Why am I showing this to you? Because we have to understand, we have to accept the idea that today there is not a more important skill. Because in the past, people thought, okay, my class is more auditory. My class is um, more inclined to be familiar with the listening activities. So I'm going to concentrate on listening. And then listening was always the lane for teachers, right? And students. Teacher, we don't understand anything. I can't understand English. And then the traumas and all the other situations would come together with that. But that's not the point. Okay, if your class is more auditory, you will concentrate your planning, your activities on that style, but you need to use the others too. So we call this balanced approach, and I'm showing this to you because the assessment and the evaluation will have to get into your planning. How can you establish that your students are progressing in that skill? How can you establish if your students are incorporating other learning styles? The only answer for that is assessment and evaluation of the skill. Of course, and I will show you a list later on with some ideas to make that assessment or that evaluation, right? But this is just for didactical reasons. Of course, you can take examples of listening assessment and use for speaking, for example, because we know today that listening and speaking are usually part of the same process, correct? So we have listening and speaking, and we have reading and writing. Although they are mixed in our minds, okay, we don't separate them. We know that they are more intimately related in pairs, right? So basically, the idea is this, right? That you incorporate in your planning a balance between the learning styles and the skills. And that while using those things, you try to get into assessment and evaluation to measure how you are progressing. Because you see, you have 2 or 3 classes to teach a unit. You need to keep that idea of the balanced approach in all the units. So that's not for a class only, it's for the unit. So if you make your assessment or your evaluation in one class and you get the information that something is not going correctly, is not going well, you have time to change the other classes, right? So this balance, this idea that you can see in this screen, it doesn't happen only for one class. It has to be planned for the unit, right? So in this way, you will be helping your students to develop all the 4 skills equally. And you will be trying to use all the learning styles equally. And because of that necessity, you need to be doing assessment and evaluation all the time. You can choose one thing in the activity to use as assessment or as evaluation. It's no problem. It depends on your planning. Depends on the number of students you have, on the time you need to teach a unit. Those elements of the planning of a class, they didn't change. So by implementing assessment and evaluation every class and every time, you can get the necessary information to make necessary changes during the lessons. Correct, Raisa? Okay, so what you can see in the screen is an example, right, of what we can do to find this balance. In the best,
Professor, are
yeah,
you changing the slides on your screen?
am I what?
On your screen.
If
Are
I
you?
can,
No, if you are changing.
I will.
Ah, okay. Okay, because I thought my screen was lagging. It's not.
No, just a second.
Okay.
I understand now what you're saying. Yeah, just a second.
Okay, it's working.
It changed?
It changed.
Right. Good. Sorry, Haisa. Can you understand now what I was saying? Yeah? Right. So we do this for all the units, right? So what you can see there is like the balance, okay, between the skill and the learning style. The skill is intrinsic to the activity. For example, when you have pronunciation, this is speaking and listening. When you have conversation, listen and practice, this is listening. So you plan, oh, see? This is the balance, the supplement, correct? Aisa? Can you see what I
Yes,
did?
I can. I
Right,
can.
so what I did first, I identified the learning styles, okay? And the skill is there in the activities. Then I made a supplement, correct? To get into that balance, correct? Because I have to use the style that is more predominant in the class. But I also need to find that balance. If the book you use was written based on the communicative approach, then this idea, right, is already there. The idea of the multi skills and the fluency and etc. But the learning style is not there, right? You understand, Raisa? Now that you can see the screen,
Yeah,
ask your questions.
the learning style you mean as student,
Visual,
visual.
auditory. So, and you were better at understanding what people say than what you see. If you are visual, you were better when you see things than you just listen to things. And if you are kinesthetic, you like to move, you like to
Yeah.
touch while you are learning. You learn better that way. That's usually the case of children, right?
Yeah.
But for example, it was me and my brother at school, right? When we were studying, um, I needed to copy what the teacher said. Okay, I need to see things in the on the boards to learn better. My brother didn't have a notebook. He just sat there listening to what the teacher said, and he could learn even better than I because he was auditory and I was visual. Of course, as I said before, why the balance? Because all of us have all the learning styles and all of us have all the skills. That is a predominance, but we need, because of this idea of communication, to make students acquire all the skills. Okay? So,
Yeah, I
and
understand.
how do you solve the problems? How do you deal with this balance? By using assessment and evaluation. There is no other way you can move towards this balance and this communication if you don't use all the skills in a balance.
Mm-hmm.
And this is very easy to understand, right, Raissa? So let's try to try to make an association which is not so how can I say, which is not so common, but it will help you understand.
Mm-hmm.
Let's imagine that you fall in love with a boy. When you kiss that boy for the first time, the emotion and the feeling you have from the kiss is not so good.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start asking, well, why do I love that boy? Because physically, he didn't touch me. Like, he didn't get into me.
Mm-hmm.
His kiss was terrible for me. I had a terrible sensation with that kiss. But he's a nice person. He's a companion. He's this, he's that. So there are many more positive points, but physically the point is negative.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have to make a decision. Will you try to improve the physical element because you love the boy,
Mm-hmm.
or you will say no? If physically it's not good, it's not love, so forget it. What is that? That is looking for the balance, right? Looking for a line that will give you complete realization in the love.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody goes for that, right? Everybody goes for that. The same happens inside the class. You have different positive points, different negative points. If you have one student, it's easy to manage that. But if you have 20 students, even if you have an average line, but you have 20 students with different positive points and different negative points, what is the only chance you have?
Balance.
The balance. So try to develop all the skills equally, right? And also the learning styles so that you can give the students equal chances to become proficient in communication. There is no point in having knowledge of the language if you can't use that knowledge appropriately, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the idea of the communicative approach, Raissa. I had to discuss this point with you before we get into the assessment, right? We will not have time to discuss all the skills, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to give you one example so that you can understand the point, right? The important point there. And then in the material, in the platform, you have the other skills to study. And I'm going to give you a list of those examples, right?
Okay.
Uh, I will try to post in the platform this material that we are discussing now in our video, okay?
Okay.
Is that first point clear, Raissa, to you?
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, okay. Now what you can do is try to reflect on your teaching practice.
Mm-hmm.
Do you do this? Do you use this? Do you try to implement this in your classes? It's not
Okay.
easy. Yeah. Okay.
No, it's not easy because I think the material that we use, the book and the methodology, is more based on visual learning,
Right.
and it's um, it's not really based on listening skills. It's
Uh-huh.
more for learning grammar
Uh-huh.
and even speaking um, is not really a focus.
It happens in most
Yeah,
schools.
it's
So it's
basically
not a,
just
yeah,
grammar.
right. It's not a privilege of you in your school, but um, maybe, Raisa, and that's a reflection you have to do, maybe that is happening because you are not doing the assessment of the learning styles and the skills that you could do. So you need to
Yeah,
try, right?
that's another thing. That's another thing. We know where the problem lies. We
Uh-huh.
know what is the problem,
Uh-huh.
and um, our superiors know the problem.
Right.
They developed a standard.
Uh-huh.
This standard has to be
Right.
followed by all the teachers in
Uh-huh.
all the unit, all the franchises, all the school units. So it's something that we cannot how can I say, we
Implement.
cannot change. We cannot
Uh-huh.
change. We just
Right.
have to obey.
Yeah. That's a pity, right? That's a pity. Well, anyway, what you can try to do is maybe once in a while you try to find that balance inside your practice, right? Because this is very, very important when we think of assessment and evaluation, because all that process is based on this idea.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but anyway, if you cannot change, try to be a little bit more flexible
Mm-hmm.
in your practice, right? Maybe you can insert one little thing here, one little thing there, without changing the standard completely,
Completely.
right? Okay, very nice. So let's stop this. Now, wait a minute. Lisa. Okay. So um, as I said, I'm going to give you an example. Okay, Haisen?
Okay.
I'm going to give you an example. Right. So tell me now, can you see the screen?
I can.
Okay, so I'm gonna give you the example of listening, okay? But that applies to all the other skills, as I said, okay? I'm going to post this in the platform later so you can take a closer look there.
Mm-hmm.
But, Raisa, the idea here, right, is that um, you can use an activity in your book, and that means a specific skill, as an exercise only or as a skill. So let's try to make this a little bit clear. Let's imagine that you have a listening activity, but you don't want your students to process that listening, to understand, to interpret, to discuss the listening. Let's imagine you have That day you have decided that your students, most of them, have a problem with a sound in the language. And you want to use that listening to practice or reinforce that sound. So you're going to concentrate on that sound. You are not asking your students to understand the listening, the script.
Mm-hmm.
You're asking them to identify a sound and repeat that sound. That is not using listening as a skill, because they are not using the process of listening. You are using the listening activity as an exercise,
Yeah, I get it.
right? Because this is only to practice one element of language. That's not to promote communication. So
Mm-hmm.
you're not asking them, for example, what is the context of the listening, how many people are there, what is the relationship between those two people. Let's suppose, are they married, are they friends, why are they angry, why are they angry, are they happy, why are they happy. That involves understanding the listening. But if you ask them to identify a certain sound, that's not the skill. That's not, this is only an exercise. So as you can see in this scheme, and I'm gonna change here. Can you see now?
Mm-hmm.
It's a little more detailed now, right? It's a little more detailed now, correct? So usually, Raissa, what happens is that um, you can use a certain activity. You can use a certain activity in your book, a certain material in your book, to practice the communication as a skill, really, or just an exercise. Let me give you another example. You have a text, so you have a reading activity there, correct?
Mm-hmm.
The material at that time is a reading. If you ask your students to simply identify irregular verbs or regular verbs that exist in the text,
It's an
are
exercise.
they, yeah, because they are not interpreting, they are
Mm-hmm.
not making reading comprehension, they are simply practicing one element of language. There is no context there, there is no social communication there. You're not asking them to tell you what is the reading about, if the topic is um, updated, or if it's an old topic, it doesn't exist anymore. So you can do this with all the skills. You can use the activity as an exercise only,
Mm-hmm.
or as a skill. And this is what you can see in this screen. Or one way, right? One way is exercise. Another way is the skill. Or see? Or discriminating sounds. Of course, that Raissa, when you are using the activity as a skill, all those elements are involved. They need to understand, they need to identify the sounds and the stress and the intonation so that they can follow the listening, the audio script. Okay? All this is involved, but you don't need to use the activity as a skill all the time. You can use the activity only for an exercise because you have identified on your assessment, on your evaluation, that your students need to practice a certain element of language a little more. This separation will affect your evaluation. This separation will affect your assessment. Because if you are practicing the activity, if you're using the activity as a skill, you will have to evaluate your students for communication. Sometimes, even when we are speaking Portuguese, for example, we speak wrong, but we make ourselves understood. And we follow communication process normally. You know, sometimes people say, my goodness, he speaks a terrible Portuguese. But we can understand him, so it's okay, no problem. So you can deal with the discourse. You can deal with the language socially. But when you are studying a language, you also need to acquire the so-called language competence. So there is no problem using a certain activity to practice grammar, as you said before. The problem is only practice grammar, right? Only use the studying to acquire language proficiency. Let me try.
I get it.
Yeah, let me try to give you another example. When you are taking a course at university, at the end of the course, you need to write that final paper, correct? And sometimes the advisor says, oh my goodness, forget this. This is very bad. We cannot understand it. But then you say, but listen, there is no grammar mistake here. There is no punctuation mistake. Everything is okay. But you are not communicating formally the way a final paper from college needs. This is the line between using the skill as an exercise and using the skill as a skill. And the question here is, let's imagine that in that specific class, your students have a problem with a certain sound. Then you practice, you use part of your class, part of the activities in the book to practice that sound. How do you decide when it's time to stop? How do you decide the problem has been corrected?
I have to evaluate them. I have to assess and see if they now understand
For the sound,
for the sound.
correct? For that element. This
Specific.
is one thing. How can you say, well, that group I have speaks better than write?
Evaluating.
Remember the example I gave you from the kiss? If you could say you have fallen in love with 10 different boys, okay, they say, okay, I love all the 10. How would you make a decision which one you would choose, since you love all the 10 equally? You need to have a parameter to make that decision.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so of course, Raissa, we teachers also have this problem. Some teachers are better in listening and speaking than they are in reading and writing.
Mm-hmm.
We teachers,
Is there anyone that is great at everything? Is this possible?
without practice, no.
Because
We,
I
we
think that you are capable of improving for sure, but I don't think that you can be everything at the same time, that you
no,
can be a perfect learner or a
no.
perfect teacher.
The ideal learner and the ideal teacher doesn't exist.
I think something that is nice. It's I think it's intelligent to do is to exchange teachers and make the students try different styles of teaching and
Correct.
make them feel out of their comfort zone
That's why it's not a good idea for students to have the same teacher from
forever.
first to last level. For example, in a language school, right? Because you see, Raissa, this is human, right? We have a learning style, a predominant learning style. So the tendency is that we use that learning style more frequently to teach,
Yeah.
because this is our learning style.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not an easy thing to do, right? And this, because most teachers, if you talk to teachers and say, listen, what is your methodology? He will say, oh, this is the communicative approach. But when you go into a class to observe, he doesn't do anything to improve that communication in his students.
Mm-hmm.
A very simple example. When you are teaching a dialogue, for example, in your book, um, the use of language um, is involved with formal and informal situations. Sometimes you can use the same language for both, but sometimes when you are in a formal situation, you are not permitted to use certain elements of the language. But if you observe classes, teachers very rarely discuss this with the students. They are more interested in saying, listen, this is the present perfect. So you use the present perfect to talk about the present, the past, and something that continues. And then they go into the details of the verb tense, but they don't discuss communication involvement in the language. And I repeat again, that involves, that affects your assessment and your evaluation. Imagine, how can you try to think, how would you be able to put this communication idea into a written test? Of course, you would have to use different types of questions to ask your student to prove that they would be able to communicate in that situation. And you can think about that in all the skills, right? For example, you ask your students to write a text. When you give the correction back to them, the text is all marked with grammar mistakes. But the teacher never says, okay, I could understand the message easily. I was able to follow your thoughts. Because that is communication. You can be wrong sometimes, but even then, communicate. And that affects, as I said, assessment and evaluation. So, a very basic decision you have to do, you have to make is, am I going to use this activity as an exercise or as a skill? If you're going to use it as an exercise, your assessment and your evaluation of that skill will be based on grammar, vocabulary, and the element of the language. If you're using the activity for communication, really, for students to produce the language, then your assessment and your evaluation will be different. This is more or less like you get a text, okay? You ask your students to write a composition, an essay. You read the essay and you say, okay, I understand this perfectly. Here's your essay, and then you write in the end, good thoughts, good opinion, good message. And there is no marking of mistakes in grammar or whatever. This is one thing. Now, if you are interested in marking grammar mistakes or spelling mistakes, this is another thing. What is the problem with today's teachers? Most of them, they do only one thing. They don't do the two things. And that's what they should do. So assessing and evaluating skill, okay, I skill, will be involved with this decision, okay, of using it as an exercise or using it as a skill. For example, with the listening, you have discriminating between sounds, sorry, recognizing words. This is all exercise.
Yeah.
Is it necessary? Yes, it is. Terms of the necessary components. Identifying pragmatic units. This is a skill. This is communication. So it's important. Connecting linguistic cues to paralinguistic ones and to non-linguistic in order to construct meaning. Using background knowledge and context to predict and confirm meaning. So, you can use the activity as language, or you can use the activity as skill. That, Raissa, will be the same for any skill. And that is a decision that the teacher makes based on assessment. How can you say clearly that a certain group of students have a problem with vowels?
I have to assess them.
How can you say firmly that a certain group of students are not able to recognize irregular verbs from regular verbs in the past? If you have never done anything to assess that, if you've never used the text with that purpose. Remember the Snow White story in the mirror from last week, from previous class? You need to have parameters and purposes. And, Raissa, we have to be very suspicious of that teacher who says, oh, I don't need to plan. I don't need to have this control. I have been teaching English for 20 years, so I know exactly how to observe this. Nobody can do this without assessing and without evaluation. Okay? Is that clear, Raissa, to you? I'm going to post, okay, these things in the platform too. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, and finally, Raissa, let me close here. I can't. Let me try to make this a little bigger, and then you say if it's better. Okay? Can you see, Raissa?
Yeah.
Right. See, this is only a list of ideas, okay, Raissa, that I'm showing you in order that you decide which ones you can and which ones you can't use in your classes. Some of them we already use, okay, unconsciously.
Yeah.
Right? Because they are more like part of the teaching practice. They are more automatic, right? So some of them we use like unconsciously, but there are others that we can insert in our teaching practice once in a while, okay? These are ideas, Raissa, for each individual skill. For example, first, speaking, right? Then you have some ideas. For example, like oral interviews, like a phone call. For example, let me see if I can make this very clear to you. Let's imagine you have a book and the characters are living in Portugal. When you answer a phone call in Portugal, you don't say alô. You say estou. And then you say, but in English, it doesn't happen. Very well. You can contrast the language culture in English of United States or England or whatever other country you have in your book with that in Portugal, because people are living in Portugal. So that contrast is part of what? Communication. Is part of using that to practice the skill. Correct? So it's important that when you decide to use one of these things, you are very aware of what you used the activity for, if it was for an exercise or for a skill. Correct? For example, you know there is a big discussion about reading aloud a certain text. Correct? Some people say that we should not ask our students to read aloud. Sometimes it's necessary. So if you have a text and you want to practice a certain sound, you can ask your students to repeat only the words that contain that sound. And it has to be allowed, correct? So you're using reading as an exercise. Of course, what is the problem? What is the wrong thing? You have a text, you want to practice a certain sound, then you ask your students to read aloud all the text. That's a mistake, of course. Because if you want your students to read all the text, that's not an exercise. You are using the text as a skill. And in that case, people don't read aloud. People read in silence. Even if they are muttering to themselves, but it's not allowed. The same happens, right, with speaking. If you don't have the necessary context and the necessary situation, people don't speak out aloud in the street unless they are completely drunk or they have a problem in their mind. So people don't speak to themselves unless the necessary environment, social environment, exists. Correct? So, the teacher first needs to decide if he's going to use a certain activity, a certain action as an exercise or as a skill. With that balance in mind. Because this preliminary, this primary decision will affect the assessment and the evaluation he will do. What is the point here? The ideal, the perfect world for the teacher and the students would be to do both things all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But we know
Yeah.
that sometimes we are short of time. So we need sometimes to prioritize some decision.
Mm-hmm.
The ideal would be to practice language a little and then practice communication too.
Mm-hmm. I get it.
You see, all the time. But we know that this is sometimes hard to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
So, what you have to do to assess your group diagnostically, both for language and for the skill. After that, you will have better information to decide if that group needs more exercises than skills, or if they need more skills than exercises.
Mm-hmm.
If you are one of those teachers um, that has freedom, then you can try to do both in the same activity. But unfortunately, here in Brazil, this is not the case of most schools. So, Raisa, that's the point.
Mm-hmm.
You need to improve your students' communication skills. You need to improve your students' communication tools. But you can't forget that they can only improve communication skills if they have a certain uh, domination of the language elements. Um, you know, I had a friend once. Let me see if I can illustrate this to you. I had a friend, and he he was able to understand everything you said. He had a very high level of vocabulary because he studied a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So everything you talk to him, every topic, every level of language, no problem. But he was silent 95% of the time of a conversation. Then after some time, I was very curious. And then I asked him, listen, why you don't talk? Are you shy? Are you timid? Um, why we can see that you have background
Knowledge.
knowledge. We can see that you have language proficiency. And then he looked at me and said, I can't speak the language. I know the language. I have this deep knowledge, but when I try to speak, I don't know what choices I have to make. So, in other words, he was proficient in
Knowing my
language,
skill.
but he could not put the language into action.
Mm-hmm.
This is more or less the basic difference between alfabetização e letramento. Sometimes you have a wonderful student, only only high grades in the tests. He's a wonderful student, but when you ask him to put that into communication action, he's terrible.
Mm-hmm.
This is more or less like a teacher uh, who is a researcher a wonderful and perfect researcher, but if you ask him to make a lecture in a
Terrible.
conference,
Mm-hmm.
he'll be the most terrible person.
I get it.
Is that clear to you, Raisa?
Mm-hmm. It
Yeah,
is.
very good. So this is the point of our week. Okay, Raisa? I'm going to post in the platform for you, like material complementar 1, 2 e 3,
Mm-hmm.
these 3 screens. Okay, I'm going to make the videotape available in
Mm-hmm.
the platform for you, and you have to be very careful, Raisa, now, because we still have one more class next Saturday.
Yes.
But what happens? The deadline for the activity of this week will be next weekend, not this
Mm-hmm.
weekend,
Mm-hmm.
next weekend. Okay? But next weekend we have the
Another.
final activity.
Yeah.
In that case, the deadline will not be so long because we have to make the report of grades for the school.
Mm-hmm.
So we will have like three or 2 or 3 days as a deadline.
Mm-hmm.
So what I will do the same I did the previous week. I will try to post the material, which is not going to be a big material, in the platform tomorrow,
Okay.
so that you can try to parallel the 2 activities over the week. And then when we come to the final class, which is not going to be so long and so big anymore because it's going to be a conclusion,
Mm-hmm.
then you have your 2 activities practically finished, and then you can post within the time limits.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Okay.
Right. Would you like to ask any questions, Raisa, or any comments?
The final activity is based on the material,
Not
or
completely.
it's a presentation.
No, no, no. I'm not going to ask you to make presentations, okay? This session. I'm
Mm-hmm.
gonna give you situations, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I will give you a series of situations with
Mm-hmm.
some questions, and I'm going to ask you to choose 1 or 2 of those situations
Mm-hmm.
and make comments about them. If you
Okay.
agree, disagree, if this is something that you had in your reality,
Mm-hmm.
what you did, if you have any experience, any examples based
Mm-hmm.
on that situation. You know, that's more or less like a problem solving situation,
Yeah.
but it's not going to be exactly a problem. It's gonna
Okay.
be a little food for thought, and then questions for you to reflect.
Okay.
Okay? Is that all?
Yeah. Yeah. I
Okay,
think it's
so
okay. I also have the material that it's in the platform.
uh-huh.
This is for me to study.
And
And
keep as a reference. Okay.
okay.
If you
Okay.
don't need to use it for the exercise, for the activity, you
Mm-hmm.
don't need to. Okay, you just make a
Okay.
file for your own reference.
Okay.
Okay, and
Okay.
if you have some time to read it, I would
Mm-hmm. I
strongly
did.
advise you
I
to
did.
do so. Okay, and
Mm-hmm.
remember, I will be in the chat. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
all afternoon long. So if
Mm-hmm.
you at any time or any minute you think of a question or you find a doubt, that you don't remember now, then you can get into the chat and talk to me or send me a zap out of the
Okay.
group. Okay?
No problem. So our just one final question. Our final activity is going to be a written one, and we have a deadline that is post our class.
Yeah, correct. It's gonna be probably on Wednesday, Tuesday or Wednesday after the final class.
The final class, and
Yeah.
it's not going to be
This
based
this
on this
activity,
class.
yeah, this activity today, this week, next Sunday. So I'm giving you 1 week to do it, right? But the final, it's not
It's
possible
less. Okay.
because I need to pass the grades to school. So that's gonna be like Wednesday.
Okay.
But I will post everything tomorrow in the
Okay.
platform.
No
And then
problem.
you can try to parallel or plan your time based on that,
Okay.
so that you don't lose the deadline, you don't miss the deadline. Okay?
Okay.
Very good, Raissa. Thank you very much for your presence here. It's always nice to talk to
Thank you,
you.
Professor.
Hope to see you next class. Okay?
Okay.
Have a nice weekend.
You too.
Try to rest and relax as much as you can. Thank you. Bye
Thank
bye.
you. Bye bye.